I mean, I think that takes us into a sort of a different branch of censorship, which was talked about on Monday. But we look at Ofcom, and of course, censorship remains a persistent theme for UK Column in terms of news reporting, and with very good reason. If we can just push on the on screen. But Ben and Brian spoke about it on Monday with a special reference to the influences on the so-called regulator Ofcom. And as was made clear, the central purpose of Ofcom, as far as voices which are not establishment approved are concerned, is to act as censor-in-chief. And the reason for the focus on this right now is that the parts of the Online Safety Act of 2023 are being described as coming into force. And in doing so, they're shifting the burden of responsibility for exposure to harm from the individual to the broadcasting entity. So we see here that Ofcom says that as of the 17th of March, Ofcom can now enforce against the regime. Now, not only are they able to make content providers aware of their supposed duties, but they're also empowered to enforce against the regime, as the slide shows. And critically, the specific burden, which Brian alluded to, falls upon the moderation and control of content on a platform, which may be described as user to user. So in the case of UK Column, this is a specific reference to the members' forums. And the critical distinction being made by both the Online Safety Act and Ofcom is between comments made in response to provider content, a news programme, for example, and comments made in a thread which could have been started by members themselves. So where what's called user-to-user content is concerned, Ofcom is demanding that platforms provide a risk assessment in order to articulate how they will deal with content which is deemed either harmful or unlawful, or both. And what's extremely important to understand here is that even if the provider, UK Column, for example, has not broadcast any contentious material, we may still be held liable for completely unrelated conduct by members in the forums. So I think the significance of this must be looked at in two specific ways. First of all, it sets a precedent online, which may be then rolled out into the real world. So to use a perhaps oversimplistic analogy, but at the moment, if, say, a fight breaks out in a pub, there's no suggestion that the pub should be held liable unless, of course, it or the landlord has conducted a particular activity which could have precipitated or incited the incident. So to extend this analogy, the Online Safety Act would hold the pub liable regardless of whether they were hosting a punch-up themed evening or not. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to see how any sort of venue could be threatened simply because of the conduct of the people in there, and completely regardless of the sort of event held by the venue.
And just before you go on, I mean, this is why we've seen these small forums, these volunteer-led forums, closing down over the last couple of weeks in the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, the pressure and the threat, which we'll sort of come on to, is very, very evident. And of course, the expectation is that organisations will, in effect, jump before they're pushed. But the second issue is one of discrimination. And the wording of the Act is such that the targets of Ofcom's scrutiny and powers are, of course, the independent providers, where users have a means of communicating with one another. And there exists a specific exemption for providers which only host user comments that are in response to provider content. So this means that if, say, the BBC or the Daily Mail host comments which reference criminal activity, say terrorism or incitement to violence or public order, they may not be held liable. Now, with regard to statute legislation, there are a couple of points to be made. Firstly, and as stated by the Crown Prosecution Service, there's an unenforceable pressure to deal with a crime if you witness one, but, as they go on to say, there's no legal obligation to do anything about it. They refer specifically to contacting the police. But of course, the Online Safety Act turns this on its head. And also, the Interpretation Act of 1978 suggests that it is possible for companies to be discriminated against, shown here in the Act that a person includes a body of persons, corporate or unincorporate. That goes all the way back to 1889. And this really doesn't seem to have been raised in relation to the regime of censorship. But The next thing we come to is what I would describe as an enormous conflict of interest, which is set before Ofcom, in that they're to reward themselves financially for enforcing this censorship. So this turns out to be, or could turn out to be, a very lucrative exercise. Now, last year, admittedly, they only pulled in 7 million in penalties, but they do boast that in previous years, 2018, they issued Royal Mail with a £50 million financial penalty for breaking competition law. And now they're suggesting, with the raft of powers that they have been granted, that they could fine to a value of up to 18 million, or indeed 10% of the qualifying worldwide revenue, whichever is the greater. So not only do they have a new range of enforcement powers, but they especially believe that they can interdict businesses that do not even have a UK footprint. Now, the thing to note here is that Ofcom sits within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and there can be little doubt that they would consider a success if Ofcom returned more money to them, as per the route on this diagram. So, as I said at the outset, censorship really lies at the heart of this, and Ben showed us on Monday that the Demos report suggests that we're in a democratic emergency, and I might put it that we're in an emergency of a different kind. And I think it's always worth looking back to see where this does come from, and I would therefore cite the criminal code of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, drawn up in 1924 and translated into English exactly 100 years ago, which sets out the counter-revolutionary crime. And it says here that the term counter-revolutionary is applied to any act committed with the intention of overthrowing, undermining, or weakening the authority of the workers' and peasants' government founded on the constitution of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. And the echo, I think, is impossible to ignore with the new definition of extremism in 2024, which says that extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to undermine, overturn, or replace the UK's system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights. So obviously a lot more to talk about with regard to free speech and censorship.